Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. We have about 36 people sign up virtually for today's event. And of course, we also have the in-person portion of the event at Genesis Church in Columbus, Mississippi. Shannon Evans is on site there, playing host to everyone who's at the in-person event. My name is Dwayne Moore, Executive Director of the Mount Zion Memorial Fund. I'm playing host to the virtual portion of this event today. This is the second session of the Freedom School program so far. Last week, Dr. Ajibola spoke from Genesis Church in Columbus about Africa as the cradle of civilization. We have the Zoom of his lecture from last week. We got edited and ready to share with participants. I will put a link to that up in the chat here once we get started today. That way, y'all will be able to go back if you'd like to and listen to last week's Freedom School session by Dr. Ajibola. Today, he will be carrying upon that theme that we started last week, talking more about the history of Africa, not early human history as Africa is the cradle of civilization, but talking more about the kingdoms in Africa, the early history of Africa, primarily Africa before and during the Atlantic world, when the Atlantic world began and before it happened. But Dr. Ajibola is from Nigeria as well. He was actually my student teacher assistant when I was at the University of Mississippi. I was there doing my PhD, and Dr. Ajibola came in and started grading exams in some of my American history classes. So I had the privilege of basically introducing him to American history and him getting to grade a lot of my students' exams and essays. So there for about a year when we were overlapped. He was there starting his PhD. I was there finishing my PhD. We got to get to know each other pretty well for that year back in 2018, 2019. Since that time, Dr. Ajibola has worked with the Mount Zion Memorial Fund on several different grant projects. We've had grants from the American Historical Association to design and erect a memorial to blues artist Jim Jackson in Hernando, Mississippi. We've also worked on a web atlas of African American burial grounds in Mississippi, and Dr. Ajibola worked on a lot of the Bolivar County and Carroll County research to begin the web atlas project. So he was involved with that grant as well. He also played an important role in doing a lot of the archival research, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. We've done a lot of research into the death certificates that they have at MDAH. Dr. Ajibola scanned thousands of death certificates from the late 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, basically trying to capture as many names of cemeteries as we could possibly get from that early period. That way we could know not only what the names of the cemeteries were back in the 10s and 20s when people were being buried there, but so we could get a more holistic picture of what the burial landscape looked like in a lot of these counties in the Mississippi Delta. Without some of the research he had done, we wouldn't have known about a lot of cemeteries, some of which no longer exist. We're still searching for some of them. A lot of them are on plantations. We've been able to acquire the names of tons of African-American cemeteries in Mississippi to add to our web atlas project, and Dr. Ajibola was key on a lot of that community-engaged research that we did the past couple of years. He himself now is teaching at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Just started there recently. Got a tenure track position into a book. Also presenting at several conferences and working on some articles. One of the articles that he's recently been working on was about James Meredith. And those of you who are from Mississippi might be familiar with James Meredith. He was the first African-American to integrate the University of Mississippi. But Dr. Ajibola's research looks at James Meredith and his role in the Nigerian Civil War in the 1960s. James Meredith had a unique role when he spoke about the Nigerian Civil War, and that's what Dr. Ajibola's research looks at, is how James Meredith was able to play a role in promoting the Nigerian Civil War, and some very interesting research, and you might want to check it out when it comes out. But today, we're focusing on much earlier history than integration of the University of Mississippi. we'll be focusing on African history, specifically in Africa. And then later next week, we'll start to look more at African American history. But this second week, we'll still be focused on Africa, not as the cradle of civilization, but some of the great kingdoms that existed in Africa. With no further ado, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Ajibola and let him begin. Dr. Ajibola.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I appreciate your words of encouragement for the year. Like you said, I started as a teaching assistant to Dr. Moore. That was my first year of PhD. And since then, it has been a blessing because I've learned a lot from him, and we've worked together on multiple projects, including grant writing, historical markers, and other community-based research in Mississippi. So today I'll be talking about the great kingdoms of Africa and the athletic world. And this will follow up to my lecture last week that discussed Africa as cradle of civilization, where I focus on the origin of human evolution and some of the early contribution of Africa to civilization. So I'm happy that Dr. Moore mentioned my research on James Meredith, and that is very important even in our discussion today, because by 1960, if up to today, many people of African descent in the United States still are emotionally attached to various parts of Africa, such as Ghana, Nigeria. And it is from this perspective that James Meredith became involved in the Nigerian Civil War and tried to promote one Nigeria, believing that the Civil War, if not checked, or if it was not in the favor of Nigeria, it could lead to the destabilization of Nigeria, thereby weakening the African. And this more or less talks about the Pan-African connections between Africa on the continents and those in the Americas and the diaspora generally. So today, the great kingdoms of Africa that I'll be focusing on will be Ghana Empire, Mali Empire, then the Great Zimbabwe, as well as the East African coast, especially the Swahili trading towns that emerge along the East African coast. So these kingdoms, taken together, they serve as basis to understanding African history, especially from early periods to modern periods. And this history preceded the history of Atlantic slave trades. Like I said in my previous lecture, that history of Africa, unlike what dominated the writings of Eurocentric scholars in the 19th, 20th century, history of Africa did not begin with the slave trade. So I tried to demonstrate last week that Africa was the cradle of civilization, and evidence from archaeological sources testify to the fact that the first set of humans that lived emerged in Africa. So recently, the DNA findings can also confirm some of the early discovery by archaeologists that Africa indeed is the home of modern man and the predecessor. So today, the great kingdoms that I focus on, they also contribute to world civilization, not just African civilization, because worlds connected in one way or the other. And one thing I also want to emphasize is, unlike the ancient Egypt I discussed last week, that had thousands of years interactions with the outside world, especially the Greeks and the Romans, which eventually established rule over Egypt. So many people believe that before the 15th century, these kingdoms in Africa were hidden and didn't have any connection to the outside world, and therefore could not have contributed anything meaningfully to the world civilization. And we are partly going to be examining the emergence and growth of these kingdoms, as well as what they contributed to world civilization. So how do we know of these kingdoms? So what I firstly want to mention is that archaeology, as we have seen in the case of ancient Egypt, plays a significant role in the early history of Africa. And because many of pre-colonial Africa or many of the ancient African kingdoms were called pre-literates because the art of writing was not widespread in many parts of Africa. But Egypt itself, as we could understand from last week's lecture, infected writing, and Egypt could not be said to be pre-literate society. But south of Egypt, many of these kingdoms were slow to adopt, just like many parts of the world, art of writing. But this does not mean that they did not preserve their history in other ways, which made sense to people of the community, and they were able to pass down this history from generation to generation. And I mentioned that a little bit last week, but today, one of the examples, earliest form of oral tradition that survived up to today can be found in one of the kingdoms that I'm going to discuss today, that is Mali Empire, and that talks about Sunjata epic. This Sunjata epic is more or less the normal palette that helped us to reconstruct the history of ancient Egypt. But before I mention that, I can also refer us to various writings by Arab writers. They could be Africa or Europeans or Arabs themselves, but what they use is Arabic letters to write history of African communities. And I'm going to mention the relevance of trade relations between West Africa kingdoms, these kingdoms I'm going to discuss here, and their relations with North Africa, which extended to Europe in the emergence of these writings that describe Africa and also call attention to African greatness, describing the kingdom in terms of wealth, power, and influence. So having done that, so I'll first of all start with the history of Ghana Empire. And this is the map of Africa generally. West Africa is where we're focusing on from the beginning. Ghana could be found in West Africa, so we're around this place. And this, with this map, people might think Ghana Empire is the same thing as the modern day Ghana. So I have to first of all make a disclaimer that the ancient Ghana that I'm focusing on today is not the same as modern Ghana, even though modern Ghana is popular in the African diaspora in the United States, in the South America, the Caribbean, because people of African descent try as much as possible to be connected to their roots, which is Africa. And Ghana, in recent time, has now emerged as the destiny of African Americans and other people of African descent pilgrimage to Africa. In other words, Ghana, when I mean Ghana, I'm saying Ghana, modern Ghana has now become the Mecca of African diaspora. And this is connected to Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism plays a significant role in the emergence of modern Ghana as home of African diaspora in the continent of Africa. By 1940s, 50s, we can talk about the role played by the foremost Pan-Africanists such as Kwame Nkrumah, W.B. Du Bois, who worked together to challenge various forms of global racism and segregation against. More than that, they tried to collaborate for the betterment of African race all over the world. And that kind of, but Ghana itself got its name from the ancient Ghana. And many people also love Ghana because of the contribution of ancient Ghana to human civilization. And I'm going to explain shortly why Ghana became very popular among the African diaspora, especially given the controversy that attended the history of ancient Egypt that I discussed last week. But for now, let's just see how present Ghana became relevant. So in 2019, there is this year of return where large number of people in the diaspora returned to Africa, Ghana precisely, to celebrate. And there is history to this, which I will also mention shortly. So now the famous people in Ghana States, such as actors, Idris Elba, we have players such as Memphis Depay. Everyone goes to Ghana. They are not just going for the sake of going. So they are going as historical and contemporary significance. And we can also see former US President Obama, who also visited Ghana. And this, where Obama stands, it's where it's called the door of no return. And this also have historical significance, where any African captives that comes out of this door to the Atlantic Ocean never returns to their roots. But by 2019, it was decided that the remains of some of the people who died in this diaspora should be removed, should be brought back to Africa, more or less now demystifying the myth that whoever comes out of this door will never return. But beyond that, this is my picture in Ghana in 2 years ago, 2023, doing research in Ghana, and I visited the Elmina Castle, the Cape Coast Castle, where I talked to local people concerning the significance of slave trades in Ghana. But all this Ghana I'm talking about is not the same as the ancient Ghana that I am going to be examining today. But the modern Ghana got its name from ancient Ghana. And this is also, again, part of Pan-African orientation of people like Kwame Nkrumah, who believe that Africa, before the coming of European, had various kingdoms, chiefdoms, that were at par or even above other kingdoms all over the world. So by referring back to some of the names of past kingdoms, it's more or less to assert the independence of Africa in the face of colonialism and neocolonialism. So in other words, geographically, they might not be connected, but historically they are connected because the modern Ghana took its name after ancient Ghana. And if you can see, the door of no return is where I mentioned earlier that people who goes out of this place will not come back. But I'm now discussing the map of Ghana. If you look at this brain, so this is exactly where Ghana Empire covered at its peak. So if you go down, you see this is modern Ghana. So they are not geographically connected. But of course, I can still argue that whatever was happening in Ghana Empire was still connected to the sub-Saharan Africa, because I'm going to examine or state briefly that the gods that Ghana Empire was known for, and which various Arab writers describe Ghana as land of gold, was not produced in the capital. So some were produced south of Ghana, and I would not be surprised that many of the goods that were traded in Ghana Empire were drawn from other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, including modern-day Ghana. But beyond that, the territory of ancient Ghana Empire did not extend to modern-day Ghana. But we just have to draw the connection that people like Nkrumah, because they challenge European colonialism in Africa and the colonial affair. So that's how they have to bring about the name that will glorify the past African kingdom, especially when at the time of conquest, it was claimed that Africa had no history, contributed nothing meaningfully to the world civilization, and whatever happened in Africa was more or less darkness. So by more or less naming modern African country after past kingdoms in Africa, it is more or less to demonstrate that the justification for colonial rule was just a pretext to, but whatever the case, we are trying to understand that modern Ghana is different from ancient Ghana, but ancient Ghana was so glorious, so much that modern Ghana can now take the name of ancient Ghana. So that's just the connection. But ancient Ghana we are talking about, where did this cover? How large was the ancient Ghana to be considered as an empire? So we could see that it covers from present day, if I could show this on a map, you will see from present day Mali, some parts of Burkina Faso, and it was an empire in a true sense because this kingdom was so large that it controlled many Fasa states, that they supplied tributes to Ghana Empire, which further led to further conquests. So now that we have understood the geography, the location of ancient Ghana Empire, so the next thing to discuss is the origin of Ghana Empire. So how did Ghana Empire originates? We have to go back to the history of ancient Egypt and talk about the role of the culture that is settled farming community in or along the Nile. So the same thing happened in Ghana Empire, and coupled with the fact that settled community try at some point to form confederacy, we also found the emergence of iron technology. So this iron technology became very important in the emergence of Ghana. As I'm going to talk about, Ghana was in a very as well as vulnerable geographical position that is between the Sahara Desert and the forests. So meaning that they were exposed to attack from the Sahara Desert, especially from group called St. Anja Barbars. So that's one of the group that dominate the Western Sudan, especially south of the Sahara. So they were in constant competition. And it was because of the iron technology that Ghana adopted using weapons against their rivals that eventually allowed them to come together to fight enemies, leading to the growth and emergence of a big empire. But beyond the use of iron technology, we must understand that Ghana Empire stood on a strategic location, and this strategic location is probably going to be one of the focus of this Ghana Empire, allows it to control the trade routes between the people of West Africa and people of North Africa. And this led to the emergence of trans-Saharan trades. I have to clarify that trans-Saharan trade had existed long before the emergence of Ghana because people have always traded along the Sahara routes, deserts. But the point is, the time it emerged as dominant international trade in the 5th century, especially with the introduction of camel, Ghana Empire was beginning to emerge at this point in time. And by 6th century, Ghana had shown on the map of Africa spend time. But before then, Ghana was just like every other big empire that began humbly as a small community. And it was originally called Ouagadougou. That's the first name Ghana was known before it became Ghana Empire. And because of the necessity to form confederacy, because of the necessity to organize themselves in big villages to be able to withstand the external attack, Ghana eventually grew into a bigger kingdom, and its capital was located in, so by 6th century, we can say Ghana had become a dominant state in the Sahel region, that is West Africa today. So as an empire, Ghana's location, I repeat, plays significant role because trans-Saharan trades was one of the biggest international trade in history, not just because it was a trade between West Africa people and North African people. It's because this trade extended to Europe. It extended to Europe because as soon as the North African people got some of the materials from West Africa, they further traded these materials, resources, goods with people of North Africa or people of Arab world. And from there, it's kind of extended to Europe. So we can say that the control of these trade routes became very important in the emergence of Ghana Empire. So gold particularly served as a factor of trade because all those scholars of the time that described Ghana, because of its emergence as an empire, used gold to describe Ghana. And one of the Muslim writers described this kingdom as the land of gold. Land of gold because gold was prominent as part of the trans-Saharan trade. And Ghana controlled these goods. And it's because of its control of this gold trade that many Arab writers at this point in time, those who visited Africa and those who even got the information from the traders that kind of went to Africa, associated Ghana with gold. Of course, by the time of Mali Empire, it's even more exaggerated with the pilgrimage of Massa Musa. But for the case of Ghana, it is true that Ghana dominated the trade in gold, and main source of wealth of Ghana derived from the trade in gold, even though salt from the Sahara Desert also play important role. But this gold itself was more or less the main factors for the rise of Ghana Empire, and it's good in terms of fame, power, strength, and everything. So this empire that we say is big and cover like 2, 3, 4 countries today. So how was it administered? I think this is the problem or question we should ask. And I'm going to briefly discuss this to see African kingdom was like in terms of administration. And empire as big as Ghana cannot be administered centrally because there are many vassal states that were brought under the control of Ghana king. So what we must understand is Ghana administration was divided into two: the center and again the districts. So these districts were some of the vassal states conquered, extended, because Ghana became so powerful that it was able to bring many kingdoms, smaller kingdoms under its control, and together this kingdom formed Ghana Empire. But the king, even though is the head of the administration, did not rule this whole of empire centrally. It had to more or less divide the kingdoms into two. The running of the empire, especially the center, the capital, has different administration and has the king as the head of that administration. Even then, he was not able to, not that he was not able to, he needed the assistance of advisors, ministers, to run the center itself. And that is why we have councillors, ministers who help him, especially in collecting taxes and also recording some aspect of Ghanaian history. And in this case, Muslim scholars, literate Muslims, became fairly valuable to many of these Sudanese states, including Ghana Empire, although they will be more prominent in Mali Empire than Ghana, given the fact that Islam had spread even more than it did during the Mali Ghana Empire. So the central administration was done by the king, and he was assisted by ministers and advisors, including the Muslim scholars, some of whom came to trade in Ghana, or local people who accepted Islam and had become educated in Islamic scholarship. So they were able to assist the king in managing the affair of the center. But for the districts, the king had to let the king of this conquered territory remain in charge of the affair, but they have to demonstrate loyalty to the central government. And how do they demonstrate loyalty? They have to pay taxes, they have to pay tributes, and they should be ready to supply soldiers when the king demanded to go on war with rival kingdoms. So, in other words, the existing indigenous administration was left intact so far the king will show loyalty to the central government. Failure to do so means that the king can appoint a trusted official who is going to supervise the districts and report to him. And one way in which the king tried to guarantee the loyalty of the district kings is to have their sons, that is the heir to the throne, to stay in his palace. And this serves two purposes. The first purpose is that their father, the current kings, will have to be loyal and will not sabotage the interests of the central government. And again, these heirs, when they grow older, when they assume the throne, they already learn to be loyal and they can cultivate cooperation with the king. So now let's shift to the economy of Ghana Empire. So the economy, as I've mentioned earlier, was trades. Trade was the vital aspect of the Ghana economy. And this does not mean that Ghana did not produce anything. As a matter of fact, majority of the people in Ghana Empire, they focus more on agriculture. And that is why agriculture remained the primary occupation of the people. But then the king did not make much money from agriculture. Perhaps people grow foods and they are able to sell some of the food they grow outside. But the major source of income, major source of wealth of Ghana Empire was its control of trade. And this trade, the main article of this trade were gold itself and salts. So any salts that enter Ghana Empire, there will be some taxes over it. Anyone going out, there will be some taxes going in. So we have to also remember that Ghana itself, especially at the center, did not produce gold. The gold were produced by the people's Sauda profits. So they're the one that produced the gold, and by trading this gold for salts, the kings could have double taxes, both on gold and on the salt. So whatever the case, trade itself provided an avenue for Ghana Empire to become so rich, wealthy, that many writers that wrote about Ghana at this point in time, they focus on trades, even though they mention to some extent the administration in Ghana. And through their writing, we are able to see or understand how Ghana Empire was run. So gold trade, salt trade contributed significantly to Ghana's wealth, and they formed the basis of Ghana economy. But like I said, majority of the people were still agricultural, and they produced foods that sustain not just the Ghana Empire, but food that could also be exchanged for other resources, other goods from outside. So military organization is very complex because Ghana Empire did not have standing army. They did not have standing army, but that did not mean that the military aspect of Ghana was weak. Ghana was not weak militarily. So it just means that the king only relied on the districts. So you remember that the king ensured the maximum loyalty of the districts, and he could demand some men from them when there was need for such. And in this case, whenever there was war, the king could count on the district heads to provide him with necessary soldiers. And at one point in time, one observer reported that one king was able to raise over 2,000, 20,000 warriors at a point in time. So meaning that there was a steady recruitment of warrior soldiers that could help to expand. But the importance of this strong military is not just in the number that they could provide at a point in time, but it's because it allowed Ghana Empire to also conquer more territories, and more territories allow Ghana Empire to build more wealth. And we can say that gold trade was really significant to the emergence of Ghana as an empire and sustenance of Ghana in terms of its wealth and fame. But military campaign also contributed significantly because by having more territories, more tribute to be paid, sometimes in gold, sometimes in other resources, and it will also lead to more taxes on gold trade, salt trade. So let's talk about the collapse of Ghana Empire. So this empire, by 11th century, it had reached its peak in terms of power, fame, and wealth. And we all know that salt's fame attracted envy, competition from neighboring kingdoms. especially from the San Anja Berbers, the Berber tribes, people of desert that I mentioned earlier. So they have always been in competition with Ghana Empire. And this Berber always raided in Ghana Empire. That was before the emergence of Ghana as a major empire. But this trade did not stop and got to a point where the development in this Berber territory was going to affect Ghana Empire, and that's the formation of a Muslim movement known as Al-Murafid movement. So this Al-Murafid, they were a group of Muslim people who were fighting for different things in their territory, but because their activities extended beyond their territory, so they're able to raid Ghana Empire and occasionally attack the center, making it difficult to continue the trade. The constant Al-Murafid attack considerably weakened the trading link in Ghana Empire, and this kind of led in some way to the collapse or weakening of Ghana Empire. But this is not the only thing that led to the collapse. So there are other factors such as internal crisis. Internal crisis was perhaps the most important factor that led to the collapse of Ghana Empire. At some points, all those prophecies, the princes, the prophecies that were loyal to Ghana Empire, they started to reassert themselves, their independence, so they don't want to pay tributes to Ghana Empire anymore. Some of them even challenged the center and attacked the capital. And it was a result of local issue and external attack that eventually led to the fall of Ghana Empire. But then Ghana emerged and it went away. So it didn't just go away, it went away for another empire to emerge, which is Mali Empire, that we'll talk about for probably 5-10 minutes before moving to another empire. So Mali can be said to emerge from the ashes of Ghana Empire. But again, just like previous Ghana Empire that we discussed, Mali itself is another name of a country in West Africa today, which is Mali Empire. No, which is Mali. So this Mali took its name from Mali Empire itself. And I've just displayed these two maps to show us the coverage of the two kingdoms, the medieval Mali Empire and the current Mali Empire. So you could see that the early Mali Empire, the old one, even cover some parts of Guinea. So you could say the former Mali Empire was larger than the Mali Empire, but whatever the case, just like the case of Ghana Empire, adopting this name is also to testify that kingdoms in Africa preceded colonial conquest or even the transatlantic slave trade. And how did Mali emerge from the collapse of Ghana Empire? So we've talked about the impact of Al-Murafid movement, and we've talked about the internal crisis within Ghana Empire itself that resulted in the breakaway of many states. And these states competed for power, resources, and many of them, like I said earlier, challenged and attacked Ghana center itself. And one of those that attacked Ghana were Tekru or Soso. So the kingdom of Soso itself was trying to replace Ghana as an empire. And the leader of Soso kingdom, that is Sumanguru, was more or less raiding those territories under Ghana Empire in a bid to assert itself as the new source of power in the territory. So eventually, Soso emerged as the dominant kingdom and was more or less terrorizing other smaller kingdoms. But then every empire does that. But the point that people have considered the rule of Sumanguru to be brutal, to be autocratic, really made people to rally around and challenge Sumanguru, that is the leader of Soso Empire, before it became a massive empire that would not be challenged. And one of those that challenged Soso happened to be the Malinke people, especially the Keita clan, where Sunjata emerged. They rallied around, they supported themselves. And in one of the Battle of Purina, that's where the army of Sumanguru was defeated by Sunjata. And this Sunjata became fairly important. So it is the history of this battle that have been recorded in history orally and being performed from generation to generation that have survived up to today, that we are able to understand much of the early history of Mali Empire. We're able to understand the origin of Mali Empire, and that also talks about the relevance of oral history in the construction or reconstruction of the history of Africa, especially in those periods when the art of writing had not well developed in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So Sunjata epic is very important in our understanding of the origin of Mali Empire. Even though there's some version of this Sunjata epic, it is important to understand that all of this version all of them have a figure that is known as Sunjata and Sumanguru, so pointing to similar events that led to the founding of Mali Empire. So whatever the case, less than a generation. So the Sunjata has built up a fast Mali Empire, and he was a Mansa. Mansa meaning the king of a small kingdom, and there are many Mansas, and that is why Malinke Mansas rallied around and supported themselves. But this Sunjata was able to convince other Mansas to submit their title to him, and he himself alone will become the Mansa. And that's how we have the title of Mansa as the ruler of Mali Empire. But we can just comment a little bit about the administration and economy of Mali Empire. Just like Ghana Empire, the administration was headed by the king himself, who is known as Massa. Massa, the most popular one is Massa Musa. So people think Massa Musa is the name, but Musa is just the name, while Mansa is the king. Just like we say King Musa or King Moses, King David, King whatever. So Mansa is a title. And as the supreme leader of the empire, Mansa was both the religious and secular heads of the empire. Like in Ghana Empire, he also appointed officials and advisors that help him to run his administration. But one thing I must point to here is the prominence of Muslim scholars in Mali Empire. And we have to link this to the growth of trans-Saharan trade. And this is from the 13th century upwards to the spread of Islam. So Islam had become prominent in Mali Empire. And with Islam came Islamic scholarship. And with Islamic scholarship came the art of writing. And many of these literate Muslim scholars helped to record history and serve as treasurer as well. Like in the case of Ghana too, Mali also had districts that were run by lower Mansas, or the Jata had persuaded to align to all the title of the Mansa. So like I said, they have to be loyal, like in Ghana Empire, and they must guarantee maximum cooperation. And this cooperation usually comes in the form of payment of tributes and other benefits to the center, even though Mali Empire has not learned to have standing army, unlike in the case of Ghana Empire. So the economy is almost the same. Gold production, very important, leading to the trade in goods and other resources. But another one difference that I want to point to here is that agriculture was a little bit more prominent in Mali Empire than Ghana Empire because of the fertile land in Mali Empire. Because if you look at the map of Mali Empire, was more towards the forest than Ghana Empire. But whatever the case, this help people to produce foods in large quantity that could not only sustain the local people, but also relevant for external consumption. So trade itself was also the source of wealth of Mali Empire too, and we're going to see how this gold became relevant in the writing of Mansa Musa himself. Particularly popularized the wealth of Mali Empire, and he did it in a way that almost everyone that came in contact with him believed that gold was more or less growing on the land or on the tree, could be found anywhere in Africa. But then we have to first of all see the role of Mansa Musa. So what did he do? How did he become prominent? And why is he important in historical and contemporary period? Because even in contemporary world, Mansa Musa is still regarded as the wealthiest man that ever lived. So if Mansa Musa is regarded as the wealthiest man that ever lived, so he talks about not just Mansa Musa himself, but he talks about the empire, the kingdom that produced Mansa Musa. And during this time, the glory of kingdom can be demonstrated in the affluence of the king that ruled this particular kingdom. So if you're talking about Mansa Musa as the wealthiest man that ever lived, so we are more or less talking about Mali Empire as one of the wealthiest kingdoms ever to exist in modern or ancient period. So Mansa Musa did few things in Mali Empire, and his period was seen as period of expansion. So he introduced strong system of administration, and like I said earlier, Islam became very prominent because many Mansa that came after, so they increasingly accepted religion of Islam, even though they did not force people to accept Islam. They did so for their selfish interest, not selfish interest per se, but because they wanted to facilitate trade relations between themselves, like in their kingdom, and predominantly Muslim kingdoms of North Africa. So they believed that they could only get money well from this good trade, and by having strong diplomatic relations with these kingdoms in the north, so they could facilitate trade relations, which will increase the wealth of Mali Empire. So it was during the reign of Mansa Musa that Mali Empire doubled. And if you could see the map I showed you, if you compare the map of Ghana Empire, Mali was twice the size of Ghana Empire, meaning that Mali was more prosperous. And some have attributed the expansion to the reign of Mansa Musa. And if we are to follow up on that, so we could see the wealth of Mali Empire in the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa. And the story goes like this, that when Mansa Musa, as a Muslim, was trying to perform his religious duty of going to Hajj in Mecca, he went with thousands of people, including enslaved people. And what surprised or what captivated the attention of many people was the way many of these people were dressed, adorned in gold, and the way he was able to gift gold to everyone he met on his way to Mecca. A particular instance happened in Cairo that he gifted so much gold that the price of gold dropped in Cairo, which further demonstrates the wealth of not just Mansa Musa himself, but of Mali Empire. And because of the way Mansa Musa displayed the wealth of Mali Empire, different European countries, writers, were now becoming interested in not just Mali, but Africa. They have always seen and read in the literature, in the books, in the writings of Arab writers that they regarded these kingdoms as the land of gold, land of resources. But for the first time, they are now seeing a king from this kingdom displaying this wealth in a way never experienced before in history. And this actually captured their attention. And from this moment, we now find the map of Mali appearing in the map of, we found Mali Empire appearing in the map of various European geographers, and more in, so this is the map of the time that kind of shows Mali Empire before this time, it was never happened. And then the Arab writers now became more interested in. So these are significant eventually because it was going to form some of the basis or part of the basis that European explorers, traders, merchants would be interested in sub-Saharan Africa. So the way Mali Empire, because whatever resources that people of North Africa got from Mali Empire, they traded them with the Europeans, and people now felt like if gold could be so plenty in this place, so there is need for us to locate the source of gold without relying on the Arab middlemen that almost double the price when it gets there. So this is some of the way in which Mali Empire was described under Mansa Musa. One particular writer called Ibn Battuta actually visited Mali, possibly after the pilgrimage, while many of the writers that wrote about Ghana Empire did so by getting oral information from the traders who actually went to kingdoms of West Africa to trade. They became so interested in Mali Empire that this writer wanted to visit Mali Empire. And one of those who visited was Ibn Battuta. And his writing in the 14th century had become one of the important source of reconstructing Mali Empire. And this is what he has to describe about Mali. But because of time, we can move to next slide. So I have this video to play. I've mentioned that Mansa Musa is regarded as one of the richest, not just one of the richest, is regarded as the richest man that ever lived. And each generation compares Mansa Musa to the wealthiest man at the moment. So there is this video that kind of compare Mansa Musa with Jeff Bezos. This is produced like 4 or 5 years ago when Bezos was the richest man in the world. So I'm going to play this music. It's 1 minute, and that can serve as a break for us before we move to the next kingdom.
I'm learning what is a struggle friend. I know what we friend. I'm go for a well, you cares but I see because I'm trying a lot of girls and motherfucking job. Stop. When you want work there, here haven't had enough. We're not on your truck. I know that I have got to and better that you'll go to your put and you know the words. So it's not like your whole company be price for it. You never can get in the car. You hit the car. The larger provider on the family are all for one hour was there very global and self-fishy time. There's no one even walking around another people but poor. The crowd, the promote, right, so more he, right, the reason you learn happy as a lot then. It wasn't for your stuff. The only better thing you know, her doing the place to our place, you know, for the best kind of the way. Shepherd not the fight and I but her new.
All right, so we can see that this is just like it's a comic relief. They did not live in the same generation, and there's no way to compare the two great men. But the point is to even be able to compare Mansa Musa to the wealthiest people in contemporary period, in modern time, kind of tells us how wealthy Mansa Musa's wealth has been estimated. And you could see from the video, they talked about gold, talked about soil, talked about Timbuktu. And this Timbuktu became one of the most important trading centers during Mali Empire's time, and it emerged as important trading and center of intellectual. So whatever the case, the Mali Empire under Musa was able to advertise itself, popularize itself so much that people of outside world now became interested in West Africa. And this will mark the beginning of the interest of Europeans in locating the source of gold in West Africa, because the way Mansa Musa flaunts these gold, saying if you go everywhere in Africa, you can see gold you can see gold walking on the streets, they grow the tree. But like Ghana Empire, Mali Empire also outlived its peak, and various external and internal problems resulted in the collapse of empire. Some group of scholars believe that the Mansas, the rulers that came after Mansa Musa, they were relatively weak. Some believe that Mansa Musa used the resources of Mali Empire, but of course, as we noticed in the previous slides, that it was before during the reign of Mansa Musa that Mali Empire grew in population, in landmass, territory, so they expanded significantly, almost double the size of Ghana Empire during Mansa Musa. It might be unlikely that it's because of the way Mansa Musa, and moreover, it was many generations after Mansa Musa before Mali Empire collapsed, and this led to speculation that those kings that kind of emerged after Mansa Musa, they became very weak, and especially when there was succession disputes, which also compounded the situation. Then we found, like in Ghana Empire, open rebellion from the provinces who refused to pay taxes or send tributes. And this time around, external attack from the Mosi and Tuareg led to the capture of Timbuktu. And by 1433, there was a political vacuum, which Sunga Empire, which was another great kingdom in West Africa. Well, today we are not going to talk about the Sunga Empire. We are going to talk about kingdoms in East Africa, especially the trading towns of East Africa. And we can now complete it by brief discussion of Great Zimbabwe, which became one of the early civilizations of Africa. So the next that I will talk about will focus on the trading towns of East African coasts. And I'm going to show the map of Africa again. So this East African coasts, starting from here, so you can find some of these up to Mozambique here in Southern Africa. Mozambique is classified as Southern Africa, but it's also Southeast Africa. So these coasts, the towns I'll be focusing on today, will be found around, and I'm going to show a map that's kind of, so they are found in the countries such as Kenya. Some are found in Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, then you can talk about Mozambique also. So these trades, they have a lot of things in common. These trading towns, they have a lot of things in common. There are common features that makes them to be considered as the Swahili town. And why are they referred to as Swahili town? They are referred to as Swahili town because a culture, a distinct culture emerged along this coast that was more or less a result of centuries of trade relations between people of this coast and people that came from outside world, namely Iberian Peninsula, Persia, and even from India Ocean. So this town were considered to be sophisticated at the time that European in 14, 15s, 16 reached the coast of Africa. But before then, various Arabs and Europeans, writers, visitors, talked about these cities, and they talked about them with admiration, and one was considered, that is Manimdi, as a town in Portugal. It was compared with a town in Portugal, and meaning that by 14th century, 15th century, many of those states in Africa could compete with some in Europe. So other towns of East Africa, this was described as very large town. But the most important, perhaps the most popular, the one that became very relevant to the discussion of African origin of the Swahili was Kiwa. Kiwa was also described by Ibn Battuta. And if you remember, this man went to Mali Empire, but he also went to Kiwa and described it as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed towns in the world. So meaning that these towns are sophisticated. And by 13th century, Kiwa itself has emerged as the most important Swahili town. So I'm going to comment a little bit about Kiwa because of some of the controversies associated with the history of this trading town of East African coast. And I can now link this with the controversy associated with the history of ancient Egypt. And this can now connect to the coming of Europeans, where I will stop my lecture today and set a background for the subsequent lecture next week. So the features of this Swahili trading town, they were maritime. Many of them were urban, as we have seen from the description of the Arabs and European writers. So they are also mercantile, because many of these cities brought to life or they witnessed significant growth as a result of commerce and the presence of both local traders and those that came from the overseas. But then the presence of the overseas traders should not disguise the fact that many of these towns were African. They emerged as distinct African settlements, even though they effectively grew with the contact with overseas traders, and they merged to develop a distinct culture, which we call Swahili culture. Swahili culture itself, as a language, is very important in contemporary world, in modern world, and is one of the fastest growing languages in the world. And right now, more than 20 countries, even outside of Africa, has adopted Swahili and want to learn Swahili as one of the subjects to be taught, to be learned in their college, in their high schools. So Islam was very prominent, was another one of the identity of Swahili, but not the main identity of Swahili. And the society was literate, unlike some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, because of the presence of Islam. And so all these features combined together is what actually created what we can now call Swahili, because they were maritime, urban, African, Islam literate, all from Swahili. Swahili is very, okay. So it's the economic activities that's become very important. And I don't think I should spend more time because of time. I should waste more time on this, but I can just summarize why I'm now. Okay. Okay, yes. So I'm just targeting 1 hour, 30 minutes or 2 hours maximum. So I am conscious of time. This is one of the important international trades. I've just mentioned the trans-Saharan trades some minutes ago. India Ocean trade is also relevant to our discussion of kingdoms in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. So the focus in most cases have been on the Atlantic world, but the Indian Ocean also plays a significant role. And this role it plays is not just in the connection between the East African coast and the outside world, but between the East African coast and the interior of Africa, because the tendency is to think that, well, the East African coasts owe many of the progress to the contact with outside worlds, and that's one of the controversies that I am going to mention shortly. But for now, let's just talk about relevance of the coastal town. Just like the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean also plays a significant role in human relation, and it serves as an avenue for international trade. And this trade majorly was between the people of Africa on the East African coast and the people from Asia, Arabia, and some parts of the Gulf. So this trade itself, it's about exchanging what was available in one region and getting it to another region. And as a matter of fact, ivory, gold, copper, ebony, all were part of item of trades in India Ocean trades. But the most important of it is to understand the fact that these trades are started for a long time, and after a while, because of the interactions on this East African coast, people began to work together, especially those who came from the Arab world. They settled on this coast, and by settling on this coast, they had to remain there for sometime months, they will not go. So there's no way they can live alone without interacting with local community. And in interacting with local community, so they needed to more or less intermarry. And by intermarrying, they sought to promote the trade relations. So they felt like if they could relate well with the people of the interior, so they could. So meaning that those that came as traders from Asia and Arab worlds, they eventually settled among the indigenous people. And by settling among the indigenous people, the culture became mixed, and the mixture of this culture resulted in the emergence of Swahili. Even though today, some will argue that as part of the developments that happened in Africa were as a result of outside world, and it's because of the culture that means it's because of the presence of the traders here that it was believed that this is not purely African culture, and the development that happened that I will be mentioning shortly were not African. It was as a sort of outside world. And this now formed part of the larger hypothesis, part of the larger research field about Africa, especially in the 18th, 19th century writing of the Europeans, that whatever happened in Africa, any development that they feel that is considered to be sophisticated was not done by African people except the outsiders. And that kind of relates to the ancient Egypt controversy that I mentioned earlier. If you attended this class last week, you remember we talked about the evolution of humans, and we talked about the ancient Egypt, how it emerged. And because these ancient Egypts contributed significantly to many of the civilizations in the world today, so the tendency is to believe that this is not African civilization. So we can now extend this to the Swahili coast, that is the East African coast, that is the civilization in East Africa, especially on the coasts of East Africa, was not African civilization. And if you follow this lecture, you remember that people that came to trade, they were settling down among the people. So it does not mean that people were not there before. So people were actually there. And it is the continuous interaction for centuries that effectively produced the Swahili culture. But to say that Swahili culture was purely external factor is to deny the African contribution or African origin of this culture. And if you look at the Swahili language itself, so we can understand that the Swahili language emerged from Bantu language with many borrowed words in. But for now, let's just talk about, I'm just going to show some of the civilization that by the 15th century, when the Portuguese and other European mariners visited various towns in Swahili, they encountered some of these sophisticated elements to make them think that where would this have come from? To admit that this came from indigenous Africa is more or less collapse the justification to go into Africa and to more or less think about civilization of Africa. And how are all these relevant to our discussion or to this code will be discussed towards the end of this class. But for now, these are some of the contributions of the East Africa coast. So metalworking, architecture was very important because stone structure became really prevalent in Swahili coast when many countries all over the world had not even adopted this stone building. So I've just explained situating East African coast in world civilization. So this civilization in East Africa, as sophisticated as it is, external factors had been advanced for its creation. But from evidence so far, it is clearly clear that external factors play a prominent role, but the African origin of this civilization cannot be raised because looking at the linguistics evidence and tracing the origin of the word itself, Swahili was an African word that had many borrowed words from from Arabic. So I will talk about Great Zimbabwe before I round up the lecture and tell us the significance of some of these kingdoms and how they became very important to understanding Africa and the African diaspora's history. So Great Zimbabwe, again, just Mali, Ghana Empire, Zimbabwe itself is another country in modern Africa. So you can see that many of the kingdoms that we choose today, they have contemporary relevance to the modern world. So it's not just talking about the past. So it's more or less seeing how past is connected to the present and how past continue to shape the present history. So this is Zimbabwe today, but the Zimbabwean is somewhere around this place. So just like we did for other, so we can briefly talk about the origin of Zimbabwe. So the origin of Zimbabwe is a little bit different from other parts of Africa, and that also points to the situation in Southern Africa. So in Southern Africa, every other elements were present, just farming community, just such development of iron work or iron working. But one thing that also becomes very important is the availability of cattle. Cattle became very important. And even till recent time, cattle continue to be relevant in socio-economic activities. And as a matter of fact, it was more or less like a symbol of wealth, authority. But before then, we can just talk about the origin of Zimbabwe and how it emerged at a location close to the south of Zambezi River. So Zambezi River played a prominent role in the emergence of Great Zimbabwe. Its founder, just like in the case of Ghana, where we cited Soninke people, modern Shona people, their ancestor was said to be the founder of this great civilization, that is the Great Zimbabwe. But now it lies in ruin. The civilization no longer, we can find its ruin, and its ruin now is in modern day Zimbabwe. So it was built during the late Iron Age. So I mentioned the significance of iron working in the creation of this Zimbabwe. And the word itself is derived from Shona words. So testifying or corroborating the fact that the Shona people, their ancestors were those who founded this great civilization. So the most spectacular thing about this civilization that we will point out today that also exposes various contribution of African kingdoms to world civilization is the elaborate and extensive stonewalling tradition. And this was common in various parts of Southern Africa, especially where cattle was very prominent. But it was in Great Zimbabwe that those elaborates, never seen before, emerged. And we're going to discuss how this became relevant to our discussion of our great kingdoms of, Okay, just every world civilization, every kingdom that had emerged, Zimbabwe, that is the great, the ruin, now it started as a small settlement, and cattle keeping was very relevant. And my kind of talk a little bit about the role of cattle, apart from the fact that it provided people with what they could eat, it was more or less social currency at that point in time because people rely on it to get married. If you want to get married, you need cattle. Those who control cattle control people. And to control people means they eventually emerge as those who control the land, because those without cattle had to rely on these people. They became dependent by helping them to herd their cattle, and they could also get some sustenance from them. But in terms of Great Zimbabwe, apart from cattle keeping tradition, long distance trade also play prominent role in the development of Great Zimbabwe. And this long distance trade is connected to the trade in India Ocean. And we can see one example of this trading town of the Swahili. And this more or less demonstrates how some of the history of the kingdoms of various Africa connected in one way or the other. But these kingdoms, that is the Great Zimbabwe and one of the trading towns of the Swahili, converge in terms of trades, which is Kilwa. I mentioned Kilwa earlier, that Kilwa was perhaps one of the most important trading town of the Swahili. So it became important because of the long distance trade that's connected with Zimbabwe, and that also refills the wealth that Zimbabwe could get from this long distance trade, just like Ghana Empire. So cattle keeping was very important, Iron Age development was very important, and long distance trade was also very important in the development and rise of Zimbabwe as a great kingdom. But like I said, the focus would be on the stonewalling tradition, which is very important and which many people have seen as one of the wonders in human history. And like I said, the tradition was very common among the people of Southern Africa, but it was in Great Zimbabwe that we found those very sophisticated and that captured the attention of everyone in the world. But then, why is it so important? Why, what purpose is Great Zimbabwe stonewalling? Some consider it to be for defense. It's probably to defend themselves against external attack, but it was more likely to be as a way to demonstrate the power, prestige, and mastery of the king, just like the way Mansa Musa tried as much as possible to promote the wealth of Mali Empire. Scholars believe that this stonewalling tradition, especially the elaborate ones found in Great Zimbabwe, could be associated with the need of the kings to demonstrate the power, their prestige, and their mastery. But it is important to know that even though this is purely African contribution to civilization, so there have been many European observers that are reluctant to admit that Zimbabwe's stonewalling traditions were part of African contribution to civilization. And I'm going to show one comment by European geologists who visited this place in 1871 and described the enclosure in Zimbabwe. So I'm going to let you read this. So his name is Carl Mauch. So who, after giving careful account of the impressive stone ruins that he had seen, he felt it necessary to explain their presence deep in the African interior. So he believed, I do not think that I am far wrong if I suppose that this ruin or the hill is a copy of Solomon's temple on Mount Moriah, and the building in the plain a copy of the palace where Queen of Sheba lived during her visit to Solomon. So these are some of the comments by those who visited it. And this is also related to the fact that Swahili culture had been associated with external influence. So this stonewalling in Great Zimbabwe can also be said by European scholars that this could not have originated from Africa. It's a copy of Solomon's temple, and also it looks like a copy of a palace where Queen of Sheba. So the point is, by examining many of these kingdoms, of course, Zimbabwe was later abandoned in 1450, but there are a lot of reasons for the abandonment. So it was not uncommon in this era, especially in Southern Africa, for people to migrate to new settlements when the existing settlement had become overstressed and could no longer support people, their livelihood, so they have to move to only to return some other time. But in the case of this Zimbabwe, there was another important issue that contributed to the decline and the abandonment, which is the drop in the price of goods. And this price of gold contributed to the rise of Zimbabwe, partly contributed to the rise of Zimbabwe, but drop in it remained that. But more than that, it was common for people in Southern Africa to abandon a less favorable settlement to another one where they can start their life all over again and could also come back to this place when things became very important. But the significance of these African kingdoms that I've said earlier and this Zimbabwe is to demonstrate that the history of ancient Egypt was not the history of Africa. And this stemmed from the controversy that I mentioned earlier that I was going to discuss, that if we present the history of ancient Egypt as part of history of Africa, so people are quick to remind that ancient Egypt could not have been African civilization. Just Great Zimbabwe could not have been African civilization and the Swahili could. But without talking about ancient Egyptians, without talking about focusing on the ethnic identity or racial identity of those who built ancient Egypt, it is important to understand that Africa, I made clear in my lecture last week, is one of the most complex and diverse region of the world, even though scholars and teachers of African history try to separate the northern Africa from the rest of Africa. It is important to understand that geographically, Africa is a continent, and without focusing on which, so it can still be called African civilization since this civilization emerged in Africa itself. And this is to respond to the writing of Europeans in the late 19th century that except from Egypt, that is the south of Egypt, every other thing there was darkness, no contribution to history, and the ancient Egypt itself was not African civilization. So now we have seen Ghana Empire that was fairly sophisticated. We have seen Mali Empire, fairly sophisticated, so much that the king of Mali Empire popularized this kingdom, sold this kingdom to the world that everyone became interested in this kingdom and the resources that it could offer. So we have seen the Swahili coast and how it emerged as distinct African civilization, even though external factors contributed to the development of Swahili. And also we have seen Great Zimbabwe and what its elaborate stonewalling could teach us about its contribution to civilization. So all of these taken together is to demonstrate that history of Africa did not just start with the history of colonial rule. It did not start with the history of transatlantic slave trade. And it is part of this history that even laid the foundation for the Atlantic history that began in the 14th century. And I'm quickly going to show the arrival of Portuguese, and hopefully I can round this up within 5-10 minutes so I can allow Dr. Moore to take over from here. So now, how is the arrival of the European connected to the existing history of Africa? History did not just happen in a vacuum. The European trader explorer did not just wake up one day and kind of decided to reach the coast of Africa. So it is as a result of the human interactions that have begun in Africa from time immemorial. And the recent one would be the history of Ghana Empire, Mali Empire, and the East African coast that I've just mentioned now. For instance, in the case of Ghana Empire, the way Arab writers, traders have described the resources of these kingdoms has captured the attention of various European power countries, traders, to also want to witness and even experience this greatness themselves, these resources themselves. We have to understand that the trans-Arab trade allow Arab traders from North Africa to transfer these trades they got from West Africa to Europe. But there was still for many European traders to bypass these Arab traders and get to the source of. So this has started from 13th, 14th century, the time of Mansa Musa, but there was a pressing need. So it was also another dimension of this international trade that will first of all trigger the exploration around the African coast. And this happened to be the need to more or less reach the India Ocean trade. So there is need to reach India Ocean trade and bypass the Arab traders, which again dominated this India Ocean trade and the other trade along that route. So in order to bypass them, the Portuguese reached the coast of West Africa. First of all, the Cape Verde in 1448 and the Gulf Coast in 1471. So here they have to stop and trade in gold. Trading in gold was not the ultimate aim, but it was believed that, well, by the time we trade in gold and we get more resources, we could use this to further finance, fund the other travel to the other parts of Africa, which is on the Indian Ocean. So other European countries follow the agents, traders after Portuguese, and the discovery of the New World significantly helped the further and subsequent transatlantic trades that follow. But like I said, we must understand that this is not the original cause of the Portuguese exploration. It was an addition to it, and it grew significantly after the discovery of the New World. But the original intention was, first of all, to reach the gold of African, sub-Saharan Africa, that is the south of Egypt, and also to use these resources to fund. After all, we have seen how Massa Musa tried to popularize and advertise the wealth of empire. And again, the trade that was going on in the East African coast also served as another motivation. So all these were happening together, and happening together means the discovery of the New World will play important role with various European countries who now concentrate on African trades. And this is perhaps to lay the foundation for the lecture next week that will begin with the transatlantic trade. And I'm just going to stop here. And if there will be questions, that will give me the opportunity to talk more on some of the aspects that I probably did not stress as I would have loved to stress. So thank you again, Dr. Moore, for inviting me to give this lecture on African kingdoms and African as cradle of civilization. So I'm glad to be part of this project, and I'm always happy to be part of Memorial Fund. So I'll always be available, and I'll also be present for the subsequent lecture. So thank you again, and I'll be waiting to receive questions so I can talk more on some of these topics.
I was muted. If anybody has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. I'll go ahead and ask the first questions to get things going. There was a monograph that you asked us to acquire for in-person attendees of the lectures. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the monograph, the book on the history of Africa that you asked me to acquire for in-person attendees, and if you could explain how that book can help expand upon the arguments presented in your lecture today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this book the book is the African History of Africa. It's a new book that was written by Saino Bedawi in 2023, just less than 2 years, and it's one of its recent history of Africa. But the most important thing about this book is that it focuses on the early history of Africa, and it discussed extensively some of the kingdoms and many more that I have mentioned today that I did not go into details. So these books not only talk in terms of abstracts, so it discusses the trade of the author to some of these kingdoms, and it's able to bring to readers the comments, the explanation that indigenous people from some of these regions. One particular case is the story of the ancient Egypt. Okay, so this book, right? So it's going to be the name of the author is Zainab. I'm actually going to be using this book for my African civilization class this next semester. And like I said, this book not just tell the story, it brings the perspective of the people of this region, in other words, the descendants of those we are talking about, to contribute to knowledge production. So it's not just talking from abstract. And that's one thing that kind of interests me in this book, because it's explained in details and it gives different examples to some of the more complex ideas that we might not naturally have access to. And by also involving the local people, so we're able to see how history is not just the job of our professors, it's also the history of the people we are talking about. And by hearing the voices of local people, so we are more brought intimately to the history we are talking about. And that's one of the reasons I believe this book will be very important, and people who are interested in learning further about contribution of Africa to civilization and how this can serve as a background to understanding African American history in the diaspora can also look at this book and get more information. Like I said, it's have some rich information concerning the local people who were part of history we are discussing about, and they tell this history from their own perspective. And many of the history that we study, read, talks from above by hearing the voices of the people who can legitimately trace their origin to some of the people we are talking about, can more or less serve as a demonstration of authenticity to this history. So that's one of the reasons I believe this book would be relevant for anyone interested in further studies on African civilization.
Yeah, excellent. Did anyone else want to unmute themselves and ask a question with Dr. Ajibola? You can also type a question in the chat if you'd like to, and I can read it out. Or if someone in the room would like to ask a question, okay? If anyone that would like to ask a question, you can also reach out to either me. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Janet has a question about rewatching a lecture. Would it be possible? Yeah, as a matter of fact, it will be possible. If you look above in the chat, or you may not be able to see it. I don't know if you came in a little bit late. I will repost it. But I had posted earlier in the chat about last week's lecture. Dr. Ajibola presented last week on Africa as the cradle of civilization. And we were able to cut out some of the technical errors that we made last week and put together a comprehensive lecture without a lot of that stuff. Now that's the edited version that we put up on our YouTube page. We'll also do the same thing with this lecture this week. And because we had a much more straightforward and less technical issues this week, it shouldn't be as rigorous of an editing process this week. But certainly we're going to put the lecture up on our YouTube page as well. We also live streamed this event today to Mount Zion Memorial Fund Facebook page. You should be able to rewatch the video of that live stream on our Facebook page as well. But we'll also be sharing it on YouTube. Thank you for that question, Janet.
Thank you. Okay, so outside the questions, maybe I should give final thoughts, or you give final thoughts on this. So my final thought, like I will always say, it's to understand the history of Africa from earliest time to present, and especially not focusing on just the history of our slave trade and colonial rule, can make us see Africa beyond the region that more or less participated in transatlantic slave trade as not contributing any other things to human history. And if you're talking about history of African Americans in the United States, it's important because many of these studies have noted that people that were captured and transported to the Americans came with them, with their culture, with their tradition, and many of them, even language, many of them use this culture languages to even challenge slavery and the slave trade. So if you're talking about how they use this culture and languages to challenge slavery and slave trade, so we should also be interested in understanding this culture itself, because this culture is not separate from individuals who use them to challenge the system. So we should see how this culture emerged, and this culture cannot be examined without discussing the society in which this culture emerged. And by talking about society, that kind of leads us again to these great kingdoms that we are talking about today. So to talk about this kingdom is more or less to talk about the people who, at the end of the day, come to be known as African Americans today, because many of these people came from some of these kingdoms that we are talking about today, Ghana Empire and Empire. And to talk about them without talking about culture or how this culture emerged is to more or less erase parts of their history. And to erase part of their history is to erase the person of. So this is the great connection. And by laying this foundation for the subsequent lecture, so we can now see African American history beyond starting from slave trade, and we can look back and say that this history is also connected to the history of great kingdoms and the history of the civilization. And most importantly, the history of civilization, and talking about the human evolution in a complex world where people are trying to divide and to unite, by understanding that everyone more or less came from Africa, can help to build the tension in this modern world. You can know that you are part of another person. We are not separate. We are more connected and we are more divided. And knowing this can allow us to have peaceful worlds, especially in a period of tension. And that again, still connected to contemporary and a way to make history speak to contemporary situation. So thank you again, Dr. Wayne. I'm happy to be here, and hopefully we can continue to have this every year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajibola, for coming and joining us today. This lecture today was not only enlightening, thank you for summing up so beautifully there at the end. Everything you said, I couldn't have said any better, even though I try to get that very point across every year to my own students here at Prairie View A&M in our early American history classes, survey classes. That's one of the reasons why I start that class off on the history of Africa and talking about some of the great kingdoms of Africa, to make sure the very points you made are driven home as well here to my students at my HBCU. But thank you very much. This was an excellent lecture today. I do thank everyone for joining us today. We will be publishing this on YouTube. It'll be on Facebook later. Don't forget about the next week. We will be extending this. It'll be part 3 of this 10-week series. We will be focusing next week on the Atlantic slave trade, taking it from Africa to the Americas. Dr. Jody Skipper, an anthropologist at the University of Mississippi, will be hosting the next 2 weeks lectures for us. Very lucky to have her, very lucky to have Dr. Ajibola, and we look very much forward to extending the conversation and continuing to talk about the history of African Americans and Afro-descendant peoples in the future. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.